The chamber was electric with tension. Cameras panned across rows of restless lawmakers, their faces caught between expectation and fatigue. The buzz of whispered conversations collided with the clicking of press photographers, each moment meticulously documented for a nation that had grown addicted to spectacle. Everyone knew this debate would be heated, but no one knew just how combustible it was about to become. And then, with practiced timing, Lauren Boebert seized her moment. She leaned into the microphone, voice sharp and dripping with disdain. Her words weren't aimed at policy or the merits of legislation, but at a colleague across the aisle, at Ilhan Omar. "Maybe," Boebert quipped with a smirk, "if you spent less time pretending to represent Americans and more time remembering where you really came from, we could actually get something done in this chamber." The line sliced through the air. For a fraction of a second, silence reigned. Stunned, heavy, breathless. Then the reaction came. Gasps rippled across the room, a few nervous laughs, scattered applause from those eager to amplify the insult. The sound echoed off the marble walls, bouncing between history and humiliation. Omar sat still, her face illuminated under the harsh chamber lights. Her hands rested calmly in front of her, but her eyes, steady, unflinching, told another story. Around her, allies bristled, some shifting uneasily, others shaking their heads. Opponents leaned back in satisfaction, savoring the sting of the jab. The cameras caught it all: the smirk on Boebert's lips, the unease in the chamber, the poised stillness of the woman who had been targeted. The insult wasn't just a quip. It was loaded, designed to reduce Omar to an outsider, to question her legitimacy, to turn her into a punchline for the evening news cycle. Boebert had played her card, the loud, dismissive, attention-grabbing strike, and for a moment it seemed to work. The weight of the room tilted toward her. The chatter, the laughter, the smattering of applause created the illusion of victory. It looked as though Omar had been cornered, silenced, diminished. But what no one in that chamber, not even Boebert herself, was prepared for, was what Ilhan Omar said next. The chamber that day was more than a stage for two sparring lawmakers. It was a mirror reflecting the state of America itself, fractured, divided, and hungry for a moment that could clarify what was truly at stake. On the surface, the exchange between Lauren Boebert and Ilhan Omar might have seemed like another clash of personalities in an era defined by sound bites. But beneath the surface, it carried the weight of something larger. Who gets to define belonging in America, and whose voice is allowed to stand without being mocked into silence? Boebert's attack was not just a personal jab. It was a familiar script in American politics, one where women of color, immigrants, and marginalized voices are forced to prove, again and again, that they are not outsiders. The heckle, the sneer, the cutting one-liner aimed at Omar carried with it an old, dangerous implication: "You don't belong here." It was the kind of remark designed to elicit laughter from some and silence from others, a momentary power play to remind the chamber who held the microphone and who was meant to sit quietly. But the stakes were higher than just an insult across the aisle. This was about representation. Omar didn't just carry her own name. She carried the stories of refugees who had crossed oceans, of Muslim women who wore their identity proudly despite prejudice, of communities often erased or misrepresented in national narratives. Every time she spoke, she did so not just as an individual congresswoman, but as a vessel for those voices. When she was mocked, it wasn't only Omar being diminished. It was every person who saw their dignity tied to hers. This was also about truth. In an era of political theater, where provocation often overshadowed substance, Omar's presence was itself a reminder of reality. Her life story, her resilience, her service, they all contradicted the caricatures thrown at her. The truth of who she was stood in stark contrast to the mockery hurled her way. And that tension between truth and distortion, between dignity and derision, gave the moment its gravity. The underdog narrative was undeniable. Boebert, with her microphone, her performative bravado, her eagerness to dominate, seemed to control the room. Omar, quiet and composed, appeared to be on the defensive. The audience, both in the chamber and watching through screens, could sense the imbalance. One woman wielded arrogance like a weapon. The other carried dignity like armor. The question lingered: which force would prove stronger? This was not just about Omar and Boebert. It was about whether politics would reward cruelty or composure, whether the loudest voice would always drown out the calmest one. It was about whether the chamber would once again be reduced to theater, or whether it could still become a place where dignity had power. For millions watching, consciously or not, it was a test of what America valued in its leaders. And as Boebert leaned harder into mockery, as her words sought to reduce Omar to a punchline, the stakes only grew clearer. To remain silent would be to concede the moment. To respond recklessly would risk playing into the provocation. Omar stood at a precipice. Endure the insult quietly, or rise above it with something greater than a rebuttal. A statement that could not only silence the arrogance, but also echo far beyond the walls of Congress. The chamber buzzed with tension. Every camera lens, every phone live streaming the moment seemed to tilt toward Omar, waiting. The underdog had been cornered, mocked, framed as small. The aggressor appeared triumphant. And just when it seemed the moment belonged to Boebert, the balance of power shifted. Long before the chamber lights cast her in the role of antagonist, Lauren Boebert had already cultivated a persona that thrived on confrontation. To her supporters, she was fiery, unapologetic, and brash, a self-styled outsider who claimed to speak for real Americans. To her critics, she was reckless, combative, and more interested in theater than governance. Either way, Boebert understood the power of performance. Every outburst, every insult, every microphone moment wasn't just for her colleagues in Congress. It was for the cameras, the headlines, and her base. Her rise was as unconventional as her style. A former restaurant owner with no prior political experience, Boebert rode into Congress on a wave of anti-establishment fervor. She presented herself as the embodiment of rugged independence, carrying a firearm on her hip, denouncing Washington elites, and promising to shake up the swamp. In an era where politics increasingly resembled entertainment, she knew that being loud often mattered more than being right. But beneath the fiery veneer, contradictions abounded. She proclaimed herself a champion of family values, often invoking morality in her speeches. Yet her own personal life became fodder for tabloids, with reports of legal troubles, public altercations, and scandals that clashed with the image she tried to project. She railed against corruption and insider privilege, yet critics pointed out how she, too, leaned into the perks of political office once she secured her seat. For someone who built her brand on authenticity, the cracks in the facade were hard to ignore. These contradictions didn't weaken her appeal to her base. If anything, they amplified it. Her supporters admired her brashness, interpreting every controversy as proof that she was rattling the establishment. To them, criticism from the media or political opponents wasn't disqualifying. It was validation. Boebert herself leaned into this, adopting a take-no-prisoners approach to politics. If they were talking about her, whether in outrage or admiration, she was winning. But that strategy came with consequences. Her history in Congress quickly became defined by a string of controversial remarks, often aimed not at policies, but at people. She relished the soundbite, the viral clip, the one-liner designed to sting. Colleagues became targets, especially those who represented backgrounds or ideologies different from her own. Immigrants, progressives, women of color. They were frequent subjects of her barbs. The pattern was clear. When substantive debate faltered, she resorted to mockery. When confronted with complexity, she reached for simplicity laced with scorn. For her, politics was less about persuasion and more about provocation. Each insult was a spark thrown into dry grass, igniting outrage that kept her name burning across the news cycle. And yet, that reliance on spectacle revealed something deeper, a need to dominate rather than collaborate. In moments where others might seek common ground, Boebert sought a stage. Where others might offer solutions, she offered jabs. This was not governance in the traditional sense. It was combat, and in combat, she wanted the role of the aggressor. It was this same aggression that had carried her into repeated clashes with figures like Ilhan Omar. To Boebert, Omar was an ideal target, a Muslim woman, a refugee, a progressive voice. Everything Boebert's rhetoric sought to cast as other. Attacking Omar wasn't just political, it was symbolic. It signaled to her base that she would not shy away from confronting the very embodiment of what they had been told to fear. But arrogance has a way of overreaching. The more Boebert relied on provocation, the more she underestimated the resolve of those she sought to diminish. Her interruptions, her insults, her performative jabs in the chamber were designed to humiliate. Yet in that very design lay the seeds of her vulnerability. For arrogance blinds. It convinces the aggressor that dominance is permanent, that volume equals strength, that mockery cannot be met with dignity. But history shows otherwise. And in this story, history was about to repeat itself. Because arrogance, history shows, always plants the seeds of its own undoing. Before the chamber knew her as a congresswoman, before she became a headline or a political lightning rod, Ilhan Omar was a little girl navigating war and displacement. Born in Mogadishu, Somalia, her earliest memories were not of playgrounds or picture books, but of a homeland unraveling in violence. Civil war tore apart her country, scattering her family into the uncertainty of refugee camps. For years, home was not a permanent place, but a patchwork of temporary shelters, ration lines, and the daily challenge of survival. It was in those camps that she first learned resilience, not from speeches or books, but from the quiet strength of her family. Her father reminded her that dignity was not defined by circumstance, but by how one carried themselves within it. She watched adults ration food so children could eat, neighbors share what little they had, and strangers form community amid chaos. These lessons etched themselves into her: empathy, sacrifice, and the courage to endure. When her family was finally resettled in the United States, Omar arrived with little more than hope. She was young, wide-eyed, stepping into a country that promised opportunity, yet often reminded her of her difference. The language was unfamiliar, the culture overwhelming, and prejudice quick to reveal itself. Classrooms became her first battlegrounds. Kids mocked her accent, her hijab, the unfamiliar rhythm of her name. But instead of retreating, she sharpened her will. Omar learned English rapidly, throwing herself into books, debate clubs, and community activities. She wasn't merely adapting, she was building. Each obstacle became proof that she could stand where she wasn't expected to. Where others saw limits, she carved pathways. By the time she reached young adulthood, her story was already remarkable. A refugee girl who had not only survived war, but had also found her voice in America. But Omar's drive was never about personal triumph. She carried the weight of her community with her. The memory of the camps, the struggles of immigrant families trying to navigate a new world, the silenced voices who lacked representation. She began as a community organizer, working in Minneapolis to bridge gaps for immigrant families, ensuring that housing, education, and healthcare weren't distant dreams but accessible realities. She listened before she spoke, making people feel seen in systems that had long overlooked them. Neighbors didn't just see Omar as an activist. They saw her as one of their own, someone who translated their frustrations into action. Her rise into politics was not paved by privilege, but by persistence. First serving in the Minnesota House of Representatives, she broke barriers, becoming the first Somali-American legislator in the United States. But it was her election to Congress that etched her name into history. The first hijab-wearing Muslim woman to walk onto the House floor. For many, her presence alone was revolutionary. She represented stories that America had long ignored. The refugee, the immigrant, the Muslim woman, the survivor. With that seat came scrutiny. From her very first day, Omar became a target for those who saw her existence as a challenge to their definition of America. She faced insults questioning her loyalty, racist smears about her heritage, and endless attempts to paint her as an outsider. Yet through it all, she carried herself with the same quiet dignity that had been forged years earlier in refugee camps. She did not bend. She did not retreat. Her speeches often carried a double resonance, policy proposals laced with personal history. When she spoke about housing, she remembered cramped apartments and families struggling with rent. When she fought for refugees, she remembered her own journey, clutching her father's hand while walking into the unknown. When she demanded dignity, it was not an abstract idea. It was the inheritance of survival. This resilience made her a symbol far beyond her district. Supporters saw in her a voice that challenged not only policy, but the very boundaries of belonging. Critics hurled insults, but each attack only underscored why her voice mattered. She had endured worse: war, displacement, hunger, ridicule, and still risen. How could congressional heckling possibly undo someone who had survived all of that? Omar's dignity was not performative. It was lived. Even when her opponents tried to bait her into outbursts, she responded with composure. Her calmness wasn't weakness. It was control. She knew that for every person trying to strip her identity, there were thousands who looked to her as proof that they, too, belonged. Her story was never about her alone. It was about communities who had been told they were invisible, now standing taller because one of their own stood on the House floor. It was about redefining what America looked like, sounded like, and who it represented. And it was precisely this history: the girl who survived war, the teenager who fought prejudice, the woman who carried her community into the halls of power, that prepared her for the moment that came next. The chamber had grown restless. What began as a sharp jab from Boebert was quickly turning into a relentless barrage. She leaned forward in her seat, voice raised, words dripping with condescension. Each time Omar attempted to speak, Boebert cut in. Louder, harsher, determined to dominate the room through sheer volume. "You don't belong here," Boebert sneered, pounding the desk for emphasis. "Your story doesn't make you American. It makes you a liability." Her allies chuckled, a cruel chorus egging her on. The interruptions weren't about debate anymore. They were about humiliation. Omar, however, did not take the bait. She adjusted her microphone, her composure steady, though her eyes hardened with resolve. Each time Boebert tried to rattle her, Omar paused, let the noise subside, and then answered with clarity. It was like watching a boxer absorb jabs, waiting for the perfect moment to counter. But Boebert only grew more aggressive. She mocked Omar's voice, her accent, even her pauses. "See? She can't even form a thought without stumbling." The chamber filled with murmurs, some laughing, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A line was being crossed, and everyone knew it. Up in the gallery, spectators leaned forward. Staffers whispered to each other. Journalists typed furiously, sensing that something beyond ordinary congressional sparring was unfolding. On phones across the country, live streams ticked upward as viewers tuned in. Twitter feeds started buzzing. "This is getting ugly." Omar being interrupted nonstop. "Disgraceful." "She's holding back. Watch." The tension was electric, as though the chamber itself had inhaled and was waiting to exhale. Omar's silence spoke volumes. She let Boebert rage, let her interruptions stack like brittle scaffolding, and then glanced briefly around the room. Her gaze swept the chamber, calm but cutting, as if to say, "Are you watching? Are you listening?" Boebert mistook the quiet for weakness. She doubled down, her tone now mocking and exaggerated. "This chamber is for real Americans, not stories from Somalia," she spat, the words landing like stones hurled across the aisle. Gasps rippled through the room. Even some of Boebert's usual allies looked uneasy. But Omar didn't flinch. Instead, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The faintest trace of a smile flickered at the corners of her mouth. Not amusement, but recognition. She had heard this kind of disdain before. She had carried it, survived it, risen above it. And now, she would answer it. For the first time, she leaned forward, her posture shifting from defense to readiness. Her voice when she spoke was calm, deliberate, edged with steel. "Are you finished?" she asked softly, the microphone carrying her words through the chamber like a challenge. The room stilled. Boebert blinked, thrown off by the question, by the composure in Omar's tone. The smug certainty faltered, if only for a second. Viewers at home could feel it. The hashtags began to form in real time. Calm before the storm. Asked Omar vs. Boebert. Mic drop loading. Clips circulated with captions. She's about to end her. The tension was no longer one-sided. Boebert's interruptions, once confident, now seemed frantic. Desperate to reclaim ground, she didn't realize she had already lost. The chamber leaned in, every ear straining for what Omar would say next. Because everyone knew the storm was about to break. And then came the counterstrike. A single line that turned the chamber upside down. For a heartbeat, the chamber was frozen. Boebert's insult still echoed. The smug smirk on her face, daring anyone to challenge it. Cameras panned toward Ilhan Omar, waiting, almost willing her to flinch. But she didn't. She sat in silence, the kind of silence that makes a room restless. Her eyes didn't dart nervously. Her hands didn't fidget. She simply inhaled, steady and unhurried, and let the quiet stretch until the laughter in the chamber began to feel hollow. Then, finally, Omar spoke. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the clarity of conviction, each syllable sharp and deliberate, like a scalpel cutting through noise. "Congresswoman," she began, her tone measured, her posture unshaken, "you can mock my name, you can mock my story, but what you cannot change is the truth of who I am, and what I represent." The words dropped into the room like stones into still water. Ripples of unease spread across the chamber. Boebert's grin faltered, her confidence wavering as she shifted in her chair. The mockery that had landed so easily a moment ago now seemed flimsy, almost childish, when held up against Omar's calm. Omar paused again, letting the weight of silence work in her favor. And then she continued, each sentence a deliberate strike. "I came to this country with nothing but hope. I built a life. I serve in this chamber not because of privilege, but because of perseverance. And every time you try to diminish me, you diminish the countless Americans who share that story. You diminish the very idea of America itself." Gasps broke through the room. A few quiet murmurs followed, the kind that spread like sparks. Heads nodded in the gallery. Even those who rarely sided with Omar couldn't deny the force of her composure. Boebert tried to interject, her voice rising in protest, but Omar lifted her hand slightly, not in arrogance, but in command of the moment. "No," she said firmly, her eyes steady. "You will not define me with ridicule, because my dignity, and the dignity of those I represent, is not yours to tarnish." The chamber shifted. The power dynamic was no longer in question. Boebert, who had thrived on bluster, suddenly looked smaller. The smirk was gone, replaced with a strained tightness around her mouth. Her eyes darted, searching for support, but the air had changed. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. They were listening. And Omar wasn't finished. Her voice rose slightly, not in anger but in resonance. "You want to talk about belonging? Let me tell you what belonging is. It is standing here in this chamber, carrying the voices of those who have been silenced. It is refusing to let hate write our story. Belonging is not granted by you, or anyone who thinks insults can erase identity. Belonging is lived every day by those of us who choose to fight for justice, even when mocked for daring to exist." By now the murmurs had grown louder. Applause began hesitantly, then spread, clapping, punctuating her words like a drumbeat. The chamber, which moments ago had rewarded Boebert's insult with laughter, was now leaning toward Omar, the energy unmistakable. Cameras caught Boebert shifting again, her face stiff. She tried to interrupt, but her voice cracked over the growing applause. The moment had slipped away from her, claimed by the very person she had tried to belittle. Omar, calm as ever, delivered the final blow. "So mock me if you will. Mock my name, mock my faith, mock my journey. But understand this. When arrogance mocked dignity, dignity stood tall. And the world remembered." The line landed with the weight of history. Applause erupted, now no longer hesitant but full, rolling through the chamber like a wave. Some stood, clapping. Others shook their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Boebert sat rigid, her face betraying the sting of humiliation. The clip was already destined for headlines. The phrase would be repeated, quoted, replayed, a moment etched into memory. And beyond the chamber, the story was already being written in real time. On Twitter, the first posts appeared within seconds. Omar just ended Boebert. Dignity stands. Another read, "This wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a dismantling." Hashtags began to gather momentum. Boebert destroyed. Omar strong. When dignity stood tall. On TikTok, live reactions flooded in. Young people recorded themselves gasping, cheering, replaying the clip with captions like, "This is what power looks like." Instagram stories spread the line across timelines. Screenshots of Omar's composed face paired with bold text. When arrogance mocked dignity, dignity stood tall. The digital wildfire had been lit. Inside the chamber, Omar remained composed, as if the applause didn't matter. She didn't bask in it. She didn't gloat. She simply gathered her papers, her face serene, her posture unbroken. That restraint only amplified the moment. It wasn't about victory. It was about truth. Boebert, meanwhile, shrank into her chair, her earlier bravado gone. She tried to mask it with forced indifference, but the cameras caught every flicker of discomfort. In a space where perception is power, hers had been shattered. The room slowly settled, though the energy lingered like static. Omar had not just answered an insult, she had rewritten the script. She had shown that calm could be more devastating than fury, that truth could silence mockery, that dignity could rise higher than arrogance ever hoped to climb. And as the chamber moved on, the world outside did not. Clips were being edited, headlines drafted, memes created. The shockwaves were already spreading, reaching far beyond the walls where it began. This wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a dismantling. But outside the chamber, the shockwaves were only just beginning. The chamber may have quieted, but outside its walls, the storm had only begun. Within minutes, the clip of Omar's comeback was circulating online. What started as a ripple turned into a tidal wave. Twitter feeds lit up with disbelief and celebration. Hashtags sprang to life. Omar owned. Dignity wins. Boebert destroyed. By the hour's end, they were trending nationwide. The 30-second clip became the digital campfire around which millions gathered, replaying it, sharing it, and writing their own stories into its meaning. On TikTok, creators spliced the moment into endless variations. Some set it to music, turning Omar's words into a chorus over swelling beats. Others slowed the footage down, zooming in on Boebert's shifting face, her smirk faltering as the room leaned toward Omar. Memes flooded Instagram. Side-by-side photos of Boebert's glare and Omar's calm, captioned with lines like "loud versus strong" and "storm versus steady ground." The internet had chosen its hero, and it wasn't the one who thought she owned the room. Late-night hosts joined in. Monologues opened with the clip, the crowd laughing and cheering as comedians pointed out how arrogance had met its match. On cable news, pundits dissected the exchange. Some tried to spin it, others tried to minimize it. But the image of Omar's composed face against Boebert's rattled posture told a story no commentary could erase. It was clear. The moment had transcended politics. It had become a cultural flashpoint. But the most powerful reactions didn't come from celebrities or anchors. They came from everyday Americans. In living rooms, people replayed the clip for their families. Mothers texted their daughters, "This is why you keep going." Refugees whispered to themselves, "She said it for us." Teachers brought it up in classrooms, sparking conversations about dignity and belonging. One teenager wrote on Instagram, "I've been laughed at for my accent. Watching her stand tall, it felt like she was standing for me." The pride was palpable. For many, Omar's words weren't just a rebuttal. They were vindication. They were proof that dignity, even when mocked, could rise higher than ridicule. Some cried watching it, tears born not from sadness but from recognition. Others laughed, delighting in Boebert's collapse into the very caricature she tried to pin on Omar. The responses were as varied as America itself, but they all carried the same undercurrent. Something meaningful had happened, something worth remembering. Boebert, meanwhile, became a punchline. Her insult, once delivered with smug confidence, now lived on as a meme used against her. Screenshots of her reaction circled the web, captioned with mock headlines, "When you realize the mic drop wasn't yours." For a figure who thrived on attention, this was a different kind of spotlight, one she couldn't control. Omar, in contrast, became more than a politician in that moment. She became a symbol. Her face, calm and steady, was lifted into posters, digital artwork, and viral quotes. Young activists shared the clip as motivation before rallies. Community leaders pointed to it in speeches. For those who had felt unseen, it was proof that visibility could be powerful, that silence could be broken without rage, that dignity could not only endure, but triumph. And yet, the ripple didn't stop there. International outlets picked up the story, framing it as a clash of values, an emblem of America's internal battles. In newsrooms overseas, commentators noted how Omar's comeback resonated far beyond party lines, touching on themes of identity and belonging that nations everywhere wrestle with. This wasn't just about a feud between two lawmakers, it was about what their clash represented. One side shouting for attention, the other holding steady with truth. One side relying on provocation, the other on composure. And as the internet's roar grew louder, the line between politics and culture blurred. It was no longer just an exchange in Congress. It was a parable for an age of division and resilience. Every share, every meme, every late-night joke and heartfelt post was part of the same story. Arrogance had been humbled, dignity had risen, and in that rise, millions saw themselves lifted too. And in the end, this wasn't just about two lawmakers. It was about something far bigger. It was about the values that will shape America's future, and the people willing to stand for them when the jeers are loudest. In the quiet that followed her words, something remarkable happened. The chamber, once noisy with laughter and jeers, seemed to pause. It wasn't just that Omar had spoken. It was that her voice carried something deeper than politics. It carried dignity, a reminder that character is not built on cheap insults, but on the unshakable foundation of truth. At that moment, the spectacle of arrogance collided head-on with the strength of resilience. The mockery that had been hurled at her dissolved into silence, replaced by the undeniable weight of a simple reality. Dignity always outlasts hate. Omar's response was not just for herself. It was for every immigrant who has been told they don't belong. For every woman who has been spoken over in a room that pretends not to hear her voice. For every person who has been reduced to a punchline, when their life is anything but a joke. She turned an insult into proof of something profound, that being American is not about where you began, but what values you choose to carry. Justice, equality, courage. Those are the qualities that define belonging. And in embodying them, Omar made it clear that no insult, no heckler, and no arrogance can erase what is real. This is the universal truth of the moment. Arrogance will always try to diminish. Hate will always try to divide. But dignity is stubborn. It refuses to yield. It stands tall in the storm, reminding us that true strength is not loud. It is steady. That is why her words echoed beyond the chamber into living rooms, classrooms, and workplaces across America. People didn't just hear what she said. They felt it, because it was their story too. And perhaps that is what shook the room even more than her comeback. It wasn't only a rebuttal to Boebert. It was a mirror held up to the nation. Who do we want to be? A country that rewards provocation, or a people who rise above it? A nation defined by arrogance, or one remembered for its dignity? Her words forced the question, and in asking it, she delivered the answer through her very presence. When arrogance mocked dignity, dignity stood tall, and the world remembered. That line became more than a description of the moment. It became a lesson in what it means to live with unbreakable purpose, no matter who tries to tear it down. For those watching, the impact was personal. A student told she would never succeed because of her accent. A worker laughed at for her faith. A neighbor dismissed because of his skin color. In Omar's steadiness, they saw themselves rise. They saw their pain turned into power, their struggles reflected in her triumph. And in that reflection came a quiet kind of courage. The courage to keep standing, even when the world tells you to sit down. That is why this exchange matters. It wasn't a skirmish in a chamber. It was a symbol of how truth perseveres. The dignity Omar embodied is not hers alone. It belongs to anyone willing to carry it forward. To anyone who has been told they don't belong but refuses to shrink. To anyone who chooses to define themselves not by insult, but by values that endure. So as this moment rippled outward, it became more than politics. It became a reminder. America's greatness does not lie in those who shout the loudest or belittle the most. It lies in the quiet strength of people who live their truth without apology. Omar reminded us of that, not with anger but with clarity, and that is why her words will linger far longer than the insult that tried to eclipse them. Because in the end, history does not remember the jeers. It remembers the courage that answered them. In the end, this exchange was never just about one lawmaker trying to score a cheap laugh at someone else's expense. It was about something much larger. The contest between arrogance and dignity, between shallow provocation and the kind of truth that echoes far beyond a single chamber. Lauren Boebert hurled her insult hoping to diminish Ilhan Omar, to box her into a caricature. But instead, what unfolded was the opposite. Omar's comeback didn't just silence a heckler. It reminded America that strength is measured not in volume or venom, but in composure, resilience, and clarity. That is why the title rings so true. Lauren Boebert destroyed in a heated exchange, Ilhan Omar's comeback leaving no doubt. Because the moment was undeniable. In those few words, Omar reframed the debate. She didn't just defend herself. She spoke for millions who've been told they don't belong, who've been mocked for their names, their faith, their origins, or their very existence. And in doing so, she transformed an insult into a rallying cry. This is the lesson we carry forward. Dignity can withstand the loudest jeers. Truth can cut through the thickest fog. And when arrogance tries to define who we are, it is our steadiness that writes the final word. So as you close this chapter, take a piece of it with you. Share this story. Tell others that dignity is not negotiable. Subscribe and join a community that believes in resilience over ridicule, in justice over mockery, in truth over theater. Because every time you amplify these moments, you help ensure they ripple even further. The world watched what happened. Now it's your turn to carry it forward. The stage is waiting, and the story is far from over.